My stepmom forced my boyfriend to marry her daughter. Years later, she got the shock of her life. Dear viewers, welcome back to my channel. Before I proceed, please kindly hit the subscribe button, like, and share this video to your loved ones. Your support means the world to me. Thank you. Now to my story. My name is Olivia Carter and I am 29 years old. I never imagined I'd be telling this story, but life has a way of handing you chapters you never asked to read. Back then I was deeply in love with Ryan Mitchell. We'd been together for 3 years, and in my heart I believed we were building something solid. Ryan wasn't rich, but he was driven, always talking about starting his own tech consulting firm. We dreamed together of a little house near the coast, weekend road trips, and maybe a dog once we were settled. But there was a shadow over us. My stepmother, Victoria Parker. From the moment my father married her, she carried herself like she was auditioning for some upper-class social club. She had that polished smile and voice that could sound warm to strangers, but cold as marble to those who knew her well. And she never truly accepted me. I wasn't polished enough according to her unspoken standards. She had a daughter from her previous marriage, Sophie, the kind of woman who'd been pampered all her life. Sophie could walk into a room and somehow make every conversation about herself. She didn't work, she worked. She didn't cook, she curated dining experiences. And Victoria thought the sun rose and set on her. I didn't notice it at first, but Victoria began showing an odd interest in Ryan. At family dinners, she'd lean in a little too closely when asking about his business ideas, giving these sly smiles that made me uneasy. She'd say things like, "You have so much potential, Ryan. You just need the right opportunities and the right people to open doors for you." Then one evening, after a tense dinner at their home, I overheard voices in the study. I froze outside the door. It was Victoria, her tone smooth, persuasive. "Ryan, you're a talented man," she said. "But talent without connections can only go so far. Can help you, Sophie, and I know people who could make your business a success overnight." But she let the word hang heavy with suggestion. "But what Ryan asked, his voice low. But you need to be part of this family, truly part of it. You and Sophie, you'd be unstoppable together. It's a partnership that would benefit everyone." I remember my stomach dropping, my pulse hammered in my ears. I couldn't believe she was saying it, and worse that Ryan wasn't immediately shutting it down. The next few weeks were a blur of strange excuses from him. He was busy or thinking things over. When we finally sat down to talk, he looked troubled, almost guilty. "Olivia," he began. "Victoria made me an offer and it's complicated. She can connect me with investors, introduce me to the right circles. This could change my life." I stared at him, feeling my chest tighten. "And the catch is, you have to marry Sophie." He hesitated. And in that hesitation I knew. "I love you," he said, "but I have to think about my future." Those words cut deeper than any insult could have. I walked away from that conversation shattered. He didn't chase me. Within 2 months they were engaged. The wedding was an elaborate champagne-soaked display of wealth and pretension. I didn't attend. Couldn't. I spent nights replaying everything in my mind. The laughter we'd shared, the promises we'd made. It felt like someone had reached inside me and switched out my life for one I didn't recognize. But one thing kept me breathing. A quiet vow I made to myself. I wouldn't let them see me break. I wouldn't spend my life defined by their betrayal. Even though moving on felt impossible at that moment, I promised I would find a way. In the weeks after Ryan married Sophie, I moved through life like a shadow. I went to work, came home, and tried to sleep without thinking about the two of them. Social media was cruel. Pictures of their honeymoon in Santorini, Sophie in designer dresses, Ryan looking proud beside her. Every image was a reminder of how replaceable I had been in his eyes. But the anger I felt toward them slowly began to shift. One morning, I woke up and thought, if I keep letting this control me, I'm giving them more than they've already taken. That realization hit me like a cold splash of water. I decided for the first time in months to make changes, not for revenge but for myself. I signed up for evening classes in project management and marketing. I knew I couldn't just coast along in my job forever. I wanted skills that would give me options. Those classes were hard at first. My mind would wander, and sometimes I'd cry in the bathroom during breaks, but they kept me moving forward. By spring, I'd earned my certifications. A small tech startup offered me a position managing their client accounts, and for the first time in a long while, I felt useful again. My boss, a sharp but encouraging woman named Hannah, saw potential in me and pushed me to take on more responsibility. Meanwhile, whispers about Ryan and Sophie began trickling through the grapevine. Their perfect marriage wasn't so perfect after all. Sophie's connections weren't as powerful as Victoria had promised. Investors weren't lining up to throw money at Ryan's business ideas, and Sophie had a knack for spending faster than he could earn. They argued often loudly enough that neighbors noticed. I didn't take pleasure in their problems. In fact, I barely thought about them. My life was filling with new people, new opportunities. I joined a hiking group, started volunteering at a local shelter on weekends, and even redecorated my apartment to feel like my space again. One night after a charity gala where our company had sponsored a table, I found myself standing on a balcony with a glass of wine, looking out over the city lights. The air was cool, the hum of traffic far below. I thought about how different my life looked compared to a year ago. The hurt was still there, but it didn't own me anymore. I also began to realize something. I didn't miss Ryan. I missed the person I thought he was. The man who'd share cheap takeout with me on the couch and laugh until his stomach hurt. But that man was a mirage. The real Ryan was willing to trade love for status, and I'd been lucky to see it before I'd built a life with him. By the end of that year, I'd earned a promotion. My salary had doubled, and I'd built a network of colleagues and friends who valued me. Life wasn't perfect. It never is, but it was mine. And deep down, I had a strange sense that the story between me, Victoria, and Ryan wasn't finished. Something told me that fate had its own way of circling back. I didn't know then just how right I was. It happened on an ordinary Thursday. I had just wrapped up a long meeting with a client when Hannah asked if I could join her for a dinner with a potential investor. I almost declined. I was exhausted, but something in her tone told me it was important. The restaurant was one of those high-end places I'd only seen in magazines, all soft lighting, polished wood, and waiters who seemed to float rather than walk. Hannah introduced me to the man at the head of the table, Alexander Whitmore. Alex had a quiet authority about him. He wasn't flashy, but you could feel the weight of his presence. His handshake was firm, his smile genuine, and when he spoke, people listened. We spent most of the dinner discussing business strategies, but every so often his blue eyes would lock on mine, and I'd feel an unexpected warmth in my chest. Over the next few weeks, Alex became a familiar figure in my life. He invited our team to networking events, introduced me to people who had decades of experience in our industry, and occasionally called just to ask how my day was going. It wasn't pushy, it was thoughtful, like he actually cared about the answer. One evening after a late meeting, he offered to walk me to my car. The city was alive around us. Streetlights glowing, distant music from a bar drifting through the air. He paused before I got in, his hand resting lightly on the car door. "Olivia," he said, "I hope I'm not overstepping, but I'd like to take you out. Just you and me. No business talk." I hesitated, not because I didn't want to, but because I'd built such high walls around my heart. Still, there was something about Alex. The way he listened, the way he never tried to impress me with wealth or status. I agreed. Our first date was nothing like I expected. Instead of an expensive restaurant, he took me to a quiet jazz lounge tucked away on a side street. We talked for hours about everything from childhood memories to the mistakes we'd learned from. I laughed more that night than I had in years. Weeks turned into months, and my walls began to crumble. Alex wasn't just successful. He was kind, deeply loyal, and surprisingly humble for someone whose name opened doors everywhere he went. He respected my independence and encouraged my ambitions. When he proposed, it was in the simplest, most perfect way. We were walking along a beach at sunset, the waves curling around our feet. He stopped, took my hands and said, "I don't care where life takes us as long as I'm with you. Will you marry me?" I said, "Yes," without a shred of doubt. The wedding was elegant but intimate, just close friends and family. Victoria and Sophie weren't invited. I hadn't spoken to them in years, and I didn't feel the need to change that. What they didn't know was that Alex's influence and wealth made Victoria's connections look like pocket change. He wasn't just respected in business circles, he was the kind of man whose presence could shift the energy of a room. And yet, I loved him not for any of that, but for the way he made me feel seen. That point, I thought my past was far behind me. I had no idea the universe was about to bring it crashing back into my present in the most unexpected way. It was Alex's idea to attend the Whitmore Foundation's annual charity gala. Normally, I enjoyed these events, the music, the sense of purpose in raising money for causes that mattered. But this year, the guest list was enormous, drawing people from every corner of business, politics, and high society. I didn't give it much thought until I walked through the grand entrance of the ballroom and saw two familiar faces I hadn't expected in 1,000 years: Victoria and Sophie. For a moment, my breath caught. Sophie stood beside a tall man in a rumpled suit, Ryan. He looked older, thinner, his eyes carrying a weight I'd never seen before. Sophie still had that air of entitlement, but there was a tightness around her smile that suggested her life wasn't as effortless as she wanted it to seem. They didn't see me right away. Alex was across the room speaking with the event's host, his presence as commanding as ever. People moved aside when he walked past, shaking his hand, addressing him with a mix of respect and admiration. I caught Victoria watching him, her eyes narrowing with the sharp focus of someone trying to place a name. When she finally looked my way, her expression froze. It was as if her brain couldn't quite process what she was seeing. Me in a floor-length silk gown laughing at something one of Alex's friends had said, looking nothing like the girl she'd so easily discarded from her family circle. The moment Alex joined me, placing a hand gently at my back, I felt the ripple it sent through them. Ryan's face drained of color, his mouth slightly open. Sophie's smile faltered. And Victoria, she blinked, her perfectly rehearsed social mask cracking just enough for me to see the shock underneath. Alex, oblivious to the personal history swirling in front of him, extended his hand toward them when we approached the table for introductions. "Alexander Whitmore," he said warmly, "and this is my wife Olivia." The word wife seemed to hang in the air. Victoria's handshake was stiff. "We know each other," she managed, glancing between me and Alex like she was piecing together a puzzle she wished she'd never started. Ryan muttered a polite greeting, but he couldn't meet my eyes for more than a second. Throughout the evening, I caught them stealing glances. Every time Alex spoke with someone, their posture shifted, leaning in, trying to overhear. When the auction began, Alex bid generously on several items, not for show but because he genuinely believed in the causes. Yet to anyone watching, it was clear. This was a man whose influence was unmatched in the room. And Victoria was watching. Oh, she was watching. I could almost hear the thoughts racing in her mind. The contrast between her perfect plan years ago and the reality standing before her now. Later in the evening, as I stepped away to get a drink, Ryan found a moment to speak. His voice was low, almost hesitant. "Olivia, you look happy." "I am," I replied simply. He swallowed hard, eyes flicking briefly toward Alex across the room. "He's quite something." "Yes," I said, allowing the corner of my mouth to lift in the smallest smile. "He is." There was nothing more to say. Whatever choices Ryan had made were his burden to carry. I had my life, my happiness, and no space left for resentment. As the night wounded down, Alex and I walked out hand in hand. Behind me, I could feel their eyes still on us, and for the first time I realized that their shock wasn't just about who I had married, It was about the fact that I had built a life far beyond the reach of their schemes. The following morning, Alex and I were having breakfast on our terrace, sunlight spilling across the table, when my phone buzzed with an unfamiliar number. I almost ignored it, but curiosity won. Olivia came, Victoria's voice carefully measured. Last night was unexpected. I sipped my coffee, letting the pause stretch. Yes, it was. I had no idea you'd done so well for yourself. She continued, her tone attempting casual, but edged with something that sounded almost like regret. Alexander Whitmore is impressive. I could have reminded her of the night I overheard her telling Ryan to marry Sophie for the sake of her so-called connections. I could have pointed out that she'd once looked at me as though I'd never amount to anything. Instead, I simply said, "I'm happy, Victoria. Truly happy." There was silence on her end long enough that I pictured her jaw tightening. Finally, she said, "If I had known, I cut her off gently. But you didn't, and that's all right. Everything worked out exactly as it should have." When I ended the call, I set the phone down without a trace of the old ache that used to follow her voice. A week later, fate handed me one final, unplanned encounter. Alex and I were leaving a meeting downtown when we ran into Ryan. He was alone, his suit a little worn, his eyes shadowed. He forced a smile. "Olivia, Alex." Alex greeted him warmly, ever the gentleman, unaware of the weight between us. Ryan and I exchanged a few polite words before he glanced down at his watch, muttered something about being late, and walked away. I watched him disappear into the crowd, wondering if he still thought about the choice he'd made and the life he'd traded for promises that never came true. That evening, Alex and I attended a dinner with close friends. As he pulled out my chair and poured my wine, I noticed the subtle way he always placed me first without making a show of it. It was in those quiet gestures, the hand on my back as we walked through a doorway, the way he remembered the smallest details I'd mentioned weeks earlier, that I was reminded why I had chosen him. Across the table, our friends laughed and told stories. Alex leaned close to whisper, "You look beautiful tonight." It wasn't for anyone else's benefit, just ours. That was the difference between him and Ryan. Alex's love wasn't a transaction or a stepping stone. It was a partnership built on respect and genuine care. Months later, Victoria sent a Christmas card. There was no apology inside, just a generic greeting, but in the faintly shaky handwriting of her signature, I read more than words could say. She'd seen the life I'd built, a life she never believed I could have, and she knew she'd played no part in it. The sweetest revenge wasn't the wealth or the status. It wasn't even the shock on their faces at the gala. It was the quiet, unshakable joy of knowing I had chosen well, loved deeply, and lived fully without needing their approval or their so-called connections. As Alex and I walked home that snowy night, after opening her card, he wrapped his arm around me. "Cold?" he asked. "Not even a little," I said, leaning into him. And I meant it in every way that mattered. If there's one thing my journey has taught me, it's that betrayal doesn't have to define you. It can refine you. When people try to cut you down for their own gain, remember that your worth isn't tied to their approval. Build your own life. Choose people who see your value without conditions, and let time show the difference. The best kind of revenge is a life so full of love and peace, you no longer care who's watching. And that's my story. Life didn't just turn the tables, it replaced the whole table with something far better than I could have imagined. So if you're in the middle of heartbreak right now, take it from me. One day you'll look back and realize the door that slammed in your face was just clearing the way for something extraordinary.